churches have been at the center of the COVID-19 outbreak here in Korea, especially with the initial explosion of the outbreak that was linked to the Shincheonji Church of Jesus in Daegu. It is considered a cult by the government and other Christian groups, but there have been multiple other cluster infections that have propped up in various churches across the nation. We also saw a couple more cases over the past couple of days as well. Now, to help us get a broader perspective on this issue and how churches are doing now, I am joined in the studio by Pastor Leo Ri. To introduce Pastor Leo, he serves as the senior pastor at City Light Seoul Church. He's also a chaplain and adjunct professor in practical theology at the Torch Trinity Graduate University in Seoul. He has traveled all over the world, speaking at various conferences, schools, organizations, and churches, and he is here to speak with us today. Thank you very much for joining us, and good morning.
Good morning. So good to be here this morning.
Thank you for joining us. All right, so let's start off with the beginning, kind of. We have to kind of go back to Shincheonji, I believe. When you first heard about this, and, I don't think a lot of people even knew Shincheonji before this outbreak. Were you aware of them? And what was your initial reaction when you heard about this sort of outbreak kind of stemming from Shincheonji?
Of course, most church people will know something about Shincheonji. They're one of Korea's most aggressive and largest cults. They spread all over the world, and especially as an international church pastor, they especially target foreigners here in Korea.
And they have a presence kind of worldwide as well, don't they?
That's right.
So when you first heard the news about Shincheonji, did you immediately get kind of worried that this could have repercussions on the rest of sort of the Christian community or churches as well?
A little bit, but I felt like it was an exposure to what Shincheonji was all about because they're very hidden and they're very undisclosed. And so it was kind of a revealing of who they really were. And so it was a good thing in a sense. But at the same time, there was a fear that people might equate this cult, which is not a Christian church, with other Christian churches, thinking that they're the same.
It's not a Christian church? I thought
it's not a Christian church.
I thought they defined themselves as being a Christian sect.
They define themselves that way, but they are far from it.
I see.
Yes, they are far from what the Bible teaches. They are far from what the church teaches, and they are very cultic. And I guess the main difference between for a cult like that is that they're very controlling, very manipulative, and so it's very easy for them to spread a virus like this because they are forced to sit for hours and hours on a Sunday service on their knees, in close proximity to each other, and they have no way out of it. There's this cultural backing behind it.
Right. So as we saw in the news, the way they worship together is quite different from regular churches as well, and that may have precipitated the spread as we saw it. All right. Did you actually then experience any negative emotions or public sort of reaction to yourself personally or your church or other churches after the Shincheonji outbreak?
Not personally, but there was a lot of things on social media and the news and things like that that equated Shincheonji as a cult with churches and that churches have to stop and things like that. And so I think churches were took a lot of precaution because of that. They had to nunchiba a lot and they had to kind of make sure that they were doing okay and that they
ensure the safety of your worshipers as well, right?
That's right.
So the government did issue guidelines that ban sort of these large groups, gatherings for services until April 5th. But that was about Easter, very, very important, if not the most important day in the Christian calendar. And some churches we saw in the news, once again, they started resuming their services and they seem to be very crowded as well. And it seemed like the government or authorities were coming down pretty hard on them. What was your reaction in seeing that?
Yeah, this is a very delicate balance between faith and fear. Are we supposed to listen to the government? We have our civil liberties, but also versus our security and our safety. And how do we balance the two? And so, I'm a cyclist, and it's sort of like. You have to wear the right gear. You have to wear a helmet, and you have to make sure your bike is in good shape in order to ride.
You have to wear the spandex uniforms too,
go faster and look sexier and things like that. But
it's not to help your performance. Okay.
No.
Did not
it's all
know
about
that.
the looks.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, I think most churches complied to the government standards and their recommendations, and I think most churches tried their best to regulate safety, things like that. that, especially in light of everything that was going on.
Because for the social good and because it was a directive from the government as well. How did
right.
your church cope with this order?
Our church and most international churches closed for at least 7 weeks.
And you had services online?
Mostly online, yes. All online. We had a small group of about 10 of our leaders who came together to help with the production of the live stream.
How was that? I mean, we've heard about the online classes. I understand it's a very different environment and quite different audience, I guess, too. But how did it go? Were people quite satisfied with the online sort of services, or would they say, "Come on, let's reopen the offline"?
It was really hard for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I could share a lot about this, but the basic thing was, the New Testament in the Bible over 65 times uses the phrase "one another," love one another, care for one another, forgive one another, even feed one another. Take care of one another, and when you're not in proximity and community with each other, it's very hard to be a church. You can't. It's hard to be a church online. And it's a necessary evil. It's a good thing, but we had to have it, and so I think it was hard for a lot of people. It's difficult, but also we saw a lot of people kind of get used to it over 2 months, and so we're seeing a lot of churches. For a lot of churches, they're opening up now, but it's hard for people to come back now because they got kind of used to this the habit of staying home and just watching online and things like that. But it's different. You're not as engaged.
But once the government sort of eased those strict social distancing measures and transitioned to the everyday life quarantine, is that when your church also resumed sort of the offline services? And
we had a hybrid service, so we had online option, but also we have the offline gathering, but with very strong safety precautions.
Maintaining the physical distance, wearing masks.
Signing in, thermal temperature. Everybody has to RSVP before they come, so we know exactly who's there, things like that.
And were most people strictly abiding by that? Did you have to sometimes turn away some worshipers then because you already kind of filled up to capacity?
Sure, we had to do that, but also if people were out at any of the clubs in those couple of weeks, we made them sign up waivers that they did not attend any of those clubs or they were not in that area during that time. Yeah.
Did you feel that maybe the government or authorities were unfairly targeting churches in a way? Because, I mean, obviously, especially these days, the Itaewon clubs and bar scene, that's been the sort of the epicenter of this major infection, 200 infections. Did you think that maybe the government and authorities should have come down harder on those facilities and entertainment facilities, which, they really find it very difficult, if not impossible, to not only maintain that physical distance and wear the masks, but even they will sometimes put down false names and contact details.
That's right.
Yeah.
We saw the irony in that. We did see how there was a difference the way churches were treated and other establishments were treated. But we wanted to err on the side of safety. And for love and care for our parishioners and the people who attended our churches, we want to make sure that we kept them safe and that they were cared for, and that was above and beyond like the best option for us. It's interesting that now that the outbreaks are happening in bars and clubs and things like that. People who do not go to church are saying, "How come the same regulations don't apply to these places?" And we're not the ones who are really saying this, but you look online or look at all the social media comments, and a lot of people are saying, "How come? Why is there such a discrepancy between these different gatherings?"
There were even some, I think, people who are pointing out the different attitude or reporting regarding these club goers, whether they were of a sort of a different, the LGBTQ community, and how they covered the Shincheonji members as well, that there were double standards and there was a gross sort of stigmatization and I don't know, witch hunting of the church members of Shincheonji, whether it's a cult or a church, whatever you call it.
Right.
Did you see the discrepancy in that as well?
A little bit, but I think in those beginning months, we weren't really sure how to attack this. We weren't really. I think the government wasn't really sure how to go after this. And
it was the very early stages, right?
Early stages, and so they had to out people, and they had to make sure that they went after. But
set an example in a way.
They had to set some kind of precedent, and maybe there was no way out of it.
Do you feel that you have received, you and other churches have received clear guidelines on how to worship in maybe also how to ease those restrictions from the government or authorities? Have you received sufficient guidelines?
I think it was up to us to find out that information. And so we talked amongst ourselves. We have an organization called AIM Korea, where all the international churches are connected to our group. And we had a lot of discussions online. We had a lot of discussions together about what we should do next. And we were always kind of had a pulse on the news and had a pulse on what the government mandates were saying. We had a pulse on what was happening in other churches. And so we were very careful in taking those next steps.
Well, speaking of next steps, Pastor Lee, what do you think is the way forward for churches, not only for your church, but I guess almost around the world as well, right? Because we're saying that this pandemic will probably be with us for at least a year, if not longer,
right.
For a vaccine or treatment to come out. Do you think you're going to continue with these hybrid services for the time being? What do you see
I think
going forward?
Going forward, we're going to see very creative ways of worship. We're going to see ways that we've never seen before about what church is. I mean, this whole pandemic has really taken off the cover of what church is in general, what worship is, what it means to be a Christian. And so when there's no longer a gathering or a place or a building, what does it mean to follow Jesus? And so for a lot of people, following Jesus was just going to church once a week. But when there's no more building,
and congregating and
right.
meeting together.
But when there's no more of that, what's your identity? You know, and so I think this is pushing people outside of their comfortable safety boundaries and realizing that church is just more than just coming to church once a week and doing your religious activity.
Can you share some ideas that you're thinking of? This
wow.
new way of worshiping?
Yeah. So a lot of churches, what they're doing is they're worshiping in small groups.
Okay.
And so they are going out instead of a big cluster of people gathering together with hundreds and thousands of people. We are some churches are going into their small groups, watching a sermon online. And this is what the original church was like. They didn't gather together, but the original church in the book of Acts was about small clusters of people gathering together in community every day and in their houses. And that was just off the charts of how this was.
So that may be one way to go forward, along with the virtual and the hybrid sort of services. You adapt to the times.
Parking lot worship. I mean, we've seen everything. Theater worship, movie drive-ins, everything. Yeah.
Well, Pastor Leo, I want to thank you very much for coming in once again and sharing your views on churches and amid the COVID-19 outbreak. That was Senior Pastor Leo Rhee at City Light Seoul Church. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.